Hi everybody, Evan here. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do a bit of review. I know that we've been throwing a lot of information at you. We've had you complete a number of very challenging projects, but all of that is really to get you in the correct headspace. It's to get you seeing and using and writing and digesting a lot of code very quickly. If this has felt overwhelming, if this has felt over your head, if you feel like it's been too fast and you can't grasp it, well, that's kind of the point. We're not trying to torture you by any means, but we are trying to shock your system, if that makes sense. Okay? You've now had to write, read, and try to understand massive amounts of new material in a very short period of time. The good news is you now have the thicker skin, such as it were, that you're going to need to really break all of this down. And that's what we're going to start doing as of now. Okay, we're going to get much more involved in understanding the concepts that we've been dealing with. It's tough to do if you don't already know how to write an HTML element and already know how to write a CSS selector. Okay, we've been challenging you up to this point very deliberately. We want you to get used to the struggle involved in coding. We want you to flex your frustration muscle, as we like to say. We want you to feel that that challenge. Hopefully it hasn't been so challenging that you feel like this is not for you or you feel like giving up. If that's the case, it's not an unusual state to be in, not by any means. And I would encourage you to come forward and talk to us about it. Talk to us about it. But I also would urge you to trust us just a little bit longer. Okay? This week will be a big turning point in a lot of different ways. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just review some of what we've already talked about. I'm not going to go all the way back to square one, but I am going to reintroduce some very key concepts, really 4 key concepts that you should focus on having mastered by the end of this week. None of this is new material at this point in time, but it is material which you might not be as confident with as we'd like you to be. Okay, so the very first concept I'm going to reintroduce here and discuss in greater depth is display, the display property. Okay, so I'm going to create a couple of divs here in my HTML. Two divs for now. And in CSS, I'm going to select those divs. Oh, this is the wrong file, pardon me. Here we go. In CSS, I'm going to select my divs, give them a background color, give them a height. Okay, and these two properties are going to make sure that we can actually see our divs, because without background color, without height, they're empty and they are invisible. Okay, and these are our two divs. They look like one massive shape, so I'm going to give each of them margin bottom just so they space out a little bit. We can see where they separate. These are our two divs. Okay, now divs, sections, mains, navs, also most text elements start by default with a property of display and a value of block. Okay, they are block elements. They are said to be block elements. Display block. Okay, and the characteristics of a block element is it always starts on a new line. It takes up the full width of the space available, and it does not let other elements sit on the same line with it. Doesn't let other elements sit next to it. Okay? That is display block. Now we can change the display property of any given element. I can change these divs from block to inline. And if I do that, they disappear. They disappear. Which brings us to the first characteristic of inline elements. They only take up as much space as their content requires. They only take up as much space as their content requires. Well, right now, our divs have 0 content. They have nothing inside them. However, if I put a little text in them, well, there we see them nice and tiny up in the corner there. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize a little bit of my window is cut off. There we go. Okay, so now we see them tiny up in the corner, and we can see where the boundaries of the divs actually extend. We can see that with the background color. And you see they're only taking up as much space as their content requires. They have a height of 150 pixels, but they're definitely not showing or rendering as 150 pixels high. And if I tried to give them a width too, that still wouldn't work. These height and width properties are not having any effect because the divs have been set to inline. They only take up as much space as their content requires. And they cannot have their height and width changed. The only way we could make our divs bigger is by adding more content. Okay? Now, between block and inline is the most useful display property, in my opinion. And that is display inline block. The most useful display value, pardon me. Display inline block. Display inline block. I'm going to save, reload my page, and this is what we see. Let me zoom out. Okay. Now, it doesn't look like a whole lot has changed between inline block and block, except now my height and width are definitely working. Let me turn off that width property. How about now? Without that width property, they behave like an inline element in every single way, except my height property is actually working. They are, in fact, 150 pixels tall. So what happens if I want them to sit next to each other and take up exactly half the page? Well, I might think to do something like width 50%. Doesn't quite work though. So let me try 49%. Oh, well, that works. Okay, so let's pause there and start writing down the characteristics of inline block. Behaves like inline elements, allows other elements on the same line. Okay, it allows other elements to sit next to it, but it can be styled with height and width. Okay, so an inline block element we can line up with other inline block elements, and we can still style it. We can still take control of how it's going to look on our page very precisely. Now, why do we need a width of 49%? Why is 50% not working? It should work, right? Well, the first thought might be maybe there's some kind of hidden margin, or some kind of weird padding, or some kind of border that we're just not seeing that is causing both of these divs to actually have a width of slightly more than 50%. Well, that doesn't cut it. That doesn't cut it. These are not helping at all. And this is actually a very tricky problem. The reason is because inline and inline block elements actually count line breaks in HTML as white space. They take up space. In other words, if I do this, write both of my divs on the same line, then with a width of 50%, display property set to inline block, they will sit next to each other and take up exactly half the page. Inline and inline block elements, they expect to be written like this. And we've seen this before, actually. An anchor is actually by default an inline element, and that's why we write it like this. Or maybe you've seen a paragraph with a span inside of it. This, again, is the same principle. This span is actually an inline element. The paragraph is a block element. It's going to take up the whole line. But the span is an inline element, which is why we write it on the same line in our HTML. That's the tendency for inline or inline block elements. I personally don't like doing that. I think it with the exception of an anchor in a list item or something more conventional, when dealing with divs that I want to sit next to each other, for example, I find this to be unattractive code. I want it to look like this. And so the way that I choose to handle this is to actually comment out the line break. And that will work. Okay? So this is something to keep in mind. I think the way inline block works is fairly straightforward. Okay, it allows elements to sit next to each other, but we can also style them with height and width. So it's critical in making horizontal nav bars. It's critical in lining up boxes of content next to each other. But if you're trying to make them exactly half the page, or if we had a third one and we wanted them to be exactly a third of the page, this is something you would need to keep in mind. The line breaks in your HTML will actually take up space. Let's try this with a third div. Okay, and inside each of these divs, let's actually put an H1. All my indents are a little weird. There we go. Okay, 3 divs with 3 H1s. And what I'm going to do, there we go. Now that looks the way that I want it. Div with an H1, div with an H1, div with an H1. And I want these 3 divs to sit next to each other perfectly on the page. So what percentage is going to be a third of my page? something like 33.3%. That's a little funky. Let's see what's going on there. Well, the reason why this is happening is because of the fact that these latter two H1s are actually 2 lines long. So it's throwing off the alignment of this whole row here. We could fix that fairly easily by either adding more text here, but that's a bit of a hacky approach. We could also fix it by forcing all of our divs to align to the top. That works. Okay, so they're all sitting perfectly, taking up 1/3 of the page, and they're going to stay that way completely. That's the power of inline block. Now let's say I don't want them to take up all of the page, though. Maybe I just want them to be something like 24% wide each. Okay, but I want them to be centered. Well, how do we center the content of an element? Text align, center. If I apply this to my body, it's going to center the divs inside the body. And it actually inherits down and centers the text inside the divs. But I want to space them out a little bit. So let me give them a margin of, get rid of this. Let's do a vertical margin of 10 pixels like we had, and a horizontal margin of, well, let's pause here and think. If each of these divs is occupying 24% of the width of this body, what's left over? What's 24 times 3? I'll make it easy. Change it to 25. What's 25 times 3? 75. That means there's 25% of empty space, which does not divide easily by 3, does it? Or rather by 6. Okay, we're going to go back to 24. 24 times 3 is going to be 72, which leaves 28% of excess space. So if I did a horizontal margin of, say, let's try 3% on either side, that means that to the left and right of each of these divs, there's going to be a margin of 3% of the width. So we're going to have 3% margin, 24% width, 3% margin, which means that each div is actually going to be taking up something more like 30%. 3% margin on each side for a total of 6, plus a width of 24%. And it spaces them out a little bit. How far can we push this? If I push the margin, the horizontal margin to 4%, it gets even bigger. If I do 5, well, then they can't sit on the same row anymore. Too much margin. Okay, but just like that, we've set ourselves up to be able to easily control our layout and present our content the way that we'd like. So that's the display property. Block, inline, inline block. Examples of block elements: H1s, block elements; paragraphs, block elements; divs, sections, block elements. Okay, and I can tell that an H1, for example, is a block element because if I create a couple, they all start on a new line. And if I inspect it with my inspector, look at how much space they're taking up. They're taking up all the space available. Okay, so most text elements like this, H1P, these are block elements. That's how they behave. What about an unordered list? Look where the bullet is. Look where the text is. What does that tell you? Our li is a block element. Li is a block element, and the ul is also a block element. Okay, so once more, the reason why we do what we do when we're creating horizontal nav bars is we take three block elements, three block element LIs, and we give them the property of display inline block to make them line up. All right, some places where you might need to be careful and actually think about what kind of element you're dealing with is when you get surprised. Like with buttons. Look at these. They have no property in CSS. I haven't set them to display inline block, but they are naturally lining up next to each other. What does that tell you? What kind of element is a button? Buttons are either inline or inline block. Well, we can change the height and width of a button, which means they're inline block. Same goes for image elements. Images are naturally inline block. Okay, so that's display. Now let's talk briefly about position. Position. To do this, I'm going to create a section which contains a div. That's it. Section contains a div. Get rid of all of this. And my section is going to be a rather large square. My div is going to be a smaller square. Section, div. Div is inside the section. All right. Now, the four position values that we discussed were absolute, relative, fixed, and static. Static is the default position of an element. When an element renders on your page, it is in its original static position. That's position static. Okay? Simple as that. Absolute. Absolute will allow us to position an element relative to the borders of our window. Okay, so I have given my div position absolute, and then if I do something like right 0, bottom 0, it jumps to the bottom right corner. If I do right 100 pixels, bottom 300 pixels, it's going to be 100 pixels from the right side of the window, 300 pixels from the bottom of the window, and it will stay there. Okay, now let me comment that out for now. Position relative allows you to move an element relative to its static position. So on its own, position relative isn't going to move anything. I applied it to the section, the big tomato colored one. Position relative on its own does not move anything, but I can add to it something like left, 150 pixels, top, 50 pixels, and that will move it 150 pixels away from its current static position, 150 pixels to the right of its original position, and 50 pixels down from its original position. Okay, these are not relative to the boundaries of the window. And if I switched them, if I did right 150 pixels, bottom 50 pixels, remember with position absolute, we would expect it to jump somewhere down here. But with position relative, it actually starts jumping off the page. It has moved from its original position 50 pixels up and 150 pixels to the left. And if we jump into our inspector, we can actually see this in action. Okay, that is position relative. Once again, position relative allows you to move an element relative to its static position. On its own, position relative will do nothing. The interesting thing here, and the valuable thing here, is what happens if we have an absolutely positioned element inside a relatively positioned element. I'm going to uncomment this. Okay, our div, which is inside our section, is positioned absolute. It has right 0, bottom 0, so we should expect it to jump down here to the bottom right corner of our page. But in this case, its direct parent, the section which contains it, is position relative. Well, how is that going to change things? In this case, our absolute child is actually being positioned relative to the boundaries of its parent, rather than the boundaries of the window. I can go outside it a little bit with negative numbers. But all of this is in relation to its parent. Okay? So it can be very powerful to have an absolutely positioned child element inside a relatively positioned parent element. And finally, there is position fixed. Get rid of this. Change my section to position fixed. And I'm going to make my body very, very tall. Which means we can scroll. Now with the section position fixed, it stays with me in the window as I scroll. Okay, remember an easy example of this is Grubhub, whose nav bar stays with you as you scroll. Or W3 Schools. Not here, but if I click on, say, Learn HTML, there we go. See, their nav bar stays with me as I scroll. Those are fixed position elements. All right. Third thing I want to talk about are CSS selectors. We've got a couple here, but these are all what are called element selectors. There are also class selectors and ID selectors, or any combination thereof. Element selectors, body, section, div, they select all of a certain type of element. So all the sections on my page, all the divs on my page, all or any, however you prefer to think about it. Okay, so no matter how many divs I create, how many sections I create, they are all going to be affected by this CSS. Class selectors use a dot and look like this. This will select all elements with a class of box. All or any. All or any elements with a class of box. And it will give it a blue background color. ID selectors use the hash or hashtag. And this will select all or any elements with the ID of CTA. All, well, let me rephrase. Apologies. Only one element should have any given ID. Only one element should have the ID of CTA. So rather, what this selector selects is the element with the ID of CTA. All divs, all elements with the class of box, the element with the ID of CTA. It's important that you think about CSS selectors using the correct language, because it can make the difference between understanding how they work and accidentally using them correctly. Okay? All or any divs on my page, all or any elements with the class of box, the single element with the ID of CTA. And CSS also comes with quite a bit of overwriting. Okay, if I give my div a class of box, it's going to change its background color. Now it has a background color of blue. The background color inside this class selector overrides the background color inside this element selector. One reason why that happens is because CSS cascades, which means the lower down the code is, the more powerful it is. And this does occur below our div selector, therefore it's more powerful. But more importantly, in CSS, specificity is king. So if I move this selector above our div selector, it still works. The background color is still blue. The reason is because .box is a more specific selector than div. This is looking for elements with a class of box. It's not just looking for any div. Class selectors are more specific than element selectors, which makes them more powerful. We have one element that satisfies both of these selectors. The code in here is going to be more powerful in determining how that element looks on our page. Finally, if I give my div an ID of CTA, it will change its color to green. For the same reason. ID selectors are even more specific than class selectors. They are the most specific. So it does occur down below, but even if I moved it up, it's still green. We now have one div which satisfies all three of these selectors. And the ID selector, being the most specific, is the most powerful. So this green overrides this blue and this purple. Of course, the width and height from our div selector still apply. Those are CSS selectors. Now, what can get you into trouble is when you start dealing with compound selectors or more complex selectors. For example, section space div. What does that select? Let me comment these out. Section space div selects any or all div elements which are inside any section elements. Div elements inside section elements. That's how that space works. We start here and work backwards. Divs inside sections. Divs inside sections. And now my div is orange. Now my div is orange. This orange background color has overridden this purple background color. And once again, even if I move this code up, it stays orange. Why? Because this is a more specific selector than this. This is more specific than this. Okay, so maybe I want all my divs on my page to be purple, but the ones which are inside sections, I want them to be orange. Very common example. Okay, now let me comment that out. Bring .box back in here. And above it, I'm going to write div.box. Now, what background color do we expect our div to have? Lime. The reason is because this is not selecting all elements with the class of box. This is selecting all divs with the class of box. All divs with the class of box, which means this is more specific than this. All divs with a class of box. If I change this to ul.box, our div is going to be blue again because it's not a ul. There are no unordered lists on our page with a class of box, so this isn't doing anything. Okay. Once again, if you have issues with selectors, I would encourage you very strongly to use the Css Selector Interpreter, available right here. Okay, this is a very useful code pen. Take any selector that you may not be sure of what it selects, plug it in and select interpret any UL element with the class of box. What happens if I add a space in there? Well, do you remember what this selected? All divs inside sections. And this selects all elements with a class of box. So all elements with a class of box inside unordered lists. Let's try it. Any element with a class of box, which is inside of any unordered list. Okay, that is CSS selectors. Now, last thing I want to talk about are file paths. File paths. The file paths that we use here, whether it's css/main.css for our external style sheet, are all what are called relative file paths, which means they direct the browser to the file or whatever it is that we're looking for relative to our starting position, relative to our index.html, or relative to our CSS style sheet. Okay, so if I add an image to my page, I include a relative file path from my index.html. I need to go and look for my image folder, and inside that image folder I want to add this image file. And I want my image to have an alt for screen readers. And there it is. There's our image element. Okay, from our index.html, go to the image folder, pull out the image file we need. Background images complicate this a little bit. I'm going to add a background image to our section. Now, background images also take a relative file path. We're not starting from the same place when we're writing a background image in our main.css. We're not starting in our index.html. We're starting in our main.css, which means there's no image file to look for around our main.css. We're still inside the CSS folder. This is not going to work. No image. Because the first stop, the first step in this file path cannot be to look for a folder. It cannot be to look for a folder that doesn't exist in this directory. We need to first tell the browser, exit the CSS folder and come to the root project folder where we can see that image folder. To do that, we use ... It's in there, but it's huge. There. Okay, and now our background image works. We need to remember that ... when dealing with background images written in CSS. Okay, if we had to go up 2 directories, ... / image. You are going to be dealing with things like this quite frequently as time goes on. And you will need to be comfortable with relative file paths as of this week when we start really using GitHub. This is important stuff. All right, everybody, I hope this was helpful, and good luck.